2 weeks passed in this strange new routine. Greta was called to morning assembly, where the guard named Ruth, whose name tag she'd memorized without meaning to, read from a clipboard in that accented German. "Hoffman, your records indicate you studied literature before all this. That's correct, isn't it?" Greta nodded, startled that anyone had bothered to look, startled that it mattered. "You're assigned to library duty. Building C. Report after breakfast. You'll handle reshelving and inventory." The library turned out to be a small square room tucked behind the administrative offices, shelves holding maybe 200 volumes. Most were German texts, novels and poetry and technical manuals provided by the Red Cross. But there was also a section of American publications, Life magazine, National Geographic, things with glossy pages and photographs in colour. She'd been told explicitly not to remove them from the premises, but nobody said she couldn't look. She began with the German books, organising by author and then by title within each section. The work settled something in her chest. Her hands remembered how to treat books properly, supporting the spine, turning pages without creasing them. It was the first time since capture that anyone had trusted her with something fragile. During her midday break, she allowed herself to flip through a Life magazine from June. The pages were impossibly vivid after years of grey newsprint and propaganda sheets. There were photographs of German cities reduced to rubble. Cologne, Dresden, places she'd known or heard about, now just skeletal frames and mountains of brick. Her throat went tight. But there were also photographs of American military cemeteries in France. Thousands upon thousands of white crosses, each one marking a young man who'd never come home. Names carved into stone. Hometowns listed. Both sides bled. Both sides buried their sons in foreign soil. The thought sat in her stomach like something indigestible. Ruth found her crying over the magazine. Not sobbing, just silent tears running down her face while she stared at a photograph of endless graves. Ruth set down 2 tin cups of coffee, the real kind, and sat down without asking permission. Greta wiped her face roughly, embarrassed. "Why are you kind to us?" The question came out before she could stop it. Ruth was quiet for a long stretch. "My grandmother taught me to read in German. Fairy tales mostly, the Grimm brothers. She came over from Prussia in 1889 with nothing except a trunk and a prayer book. She worked in a laundry until her hands bled raw every night." Ruth paused, looking at something distant. "She died last year. Never stopped speaking German, even when the neighbours gave her hell for it during the war." Greta didn't know how to respond. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure would hold weight. "What were you looking at?" Ruth nodded toward the magazine still open on the table. "The cemeteries. In France." Ruth's expression hardened just slightly. "My brother's buried there, Omaha Beach. He was 22 years old." The words landed like physical blows. Greta set the coffee down, her hands suddenly unable to hold anything steady. "I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too." Ruth stood up as if regretting the intimacy of the confession. "Get back to work, Hoffman." But the next afternoon Ruth returned during Greta's shift, lingering near the poetry section, running her fingers along the spines like someone looking for something specific. She pulled out a slim volume, Rilke, and opened it to a page someone had marked by folding down the corner. Herbstag. Ruth said the title softly. Autumn Day. My grandmother used to recite this one to us. Greta's breath stopped. Karl's favourite poem. The one he'd whispered to her the night before he'd left for the Eastern Front, believing he'd come back, believing they'd have a future. Lord, it is time. The summer was immense. Ruth glanced up, surprised. Then, in halting but grammatically correct German, she continued the next line. Lay your shadow on the sundials, and on the meadows let the winds go loose. For a moment they weren't guard and prisoner, not American and German. Just two women holding on to something beautiful in a world that had worked very hard to destroy beauty wherever it could be found. Greta's eyes filled again. She turned away quickly, but not quickly enough. He used to recite it. My fiancé, before Stalingrad. Ruth closed the book gently and returned it to its place on the shelf. I'm sorry. This time her voice carried no official distance, just the plain, terrible weight of shared grief. After Ruth left, Greta sat alone in the library, surrounded by books that had survived when so many people hadn't. The smell of old paper and ink filled the space, neutral and safe, a bridge between worlds that no longer existed. She thought about Ruth's grandmother, who'd fled poverty and found a new life in a country that would eventually send her grandson to die, liberating the land she'd abandoned. She thought about Carl, who'd believed in victory right up until the end. She thought about herself sitting in an enemy prison camp drinking coffee and discussing poetry with a woman whose brother she might have indirectly helped to kill. The contradictions were unbearable. And yet somehow she was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling something beyond simple despair. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even understanding, but it was something. A crack in the wall she'd built around herself, a sliver of light getting through. December arrived with snow that transformed the camp into something almost peaceful. 3 months since her arrival, and the rhythms of captivity had become familiar. Wake at 6, breakfast, work, lunch, recreation period, dinner, lights out at 9. The predictability was its own form of mercy. The camp commander, a Colonel Hayes, made an announcement that prisoners would be permitted to organize a Christmas celebration. The news spread through the barracks like fire through dry grass, met with equal parts excitement and suspicion. Greta watched younger women cluster together, whispering about decorations and songs they remembered from home. The older women, like Inga Weber, who'd worked in a munitions factory before capture, remained skeptical. It's a test, Inga muttered while mending a sock with practiced efficiency. They want to see who still clings to the old beliefs. But when the Americans provided a small pine tree, along with paper and scissors and extra rations for baking, even Inga softened a bit. Well, she examined the butter and sugar like precious artifacts. Waste not. The days leading up to Christmas became a flurry of activity. Women folded paper into snowflakes using techniques remembered from childhood. Someone fashioned a star from tin foil salvaged from cigarette packages. Hilda Schaefer, a young farm girl with restless hands, spent hours in the kitchen helping prepare something resembling stolen bread with the meagre luxuries they'd been given. The barracks smelled of cinnamon and nutmeg and something like anticipation. Greta threw herself into the preparations, grateful for distraction. She lettered Christmas greetings in careful script on scraps of paper, decorated the edges with simple drawings of stars and trees. It felt absurd, celebrating the birth of Christ in a prison camp, in enemy territory, a world away from everything familiar. But the absurdity was also a kind of grace. They were still alive, still capable of marking time with something other than suffering. Christmas Eve arrived cold and brilliantly clear. The barracks had been transformed. Paper snowflakes hung from the rafters, catching lamplight. The small tree stood in the corner, modest but dignified. The women gathered after dinner, faces scrubbed clean, hair combed as neat as possible. Someone had a harmonica. The first notes of Stille Nacht drifted through the room. Greta sang quietly at first, then louder. The German words filled her mouth like a prayer she'd forgotten she knew. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Around her other voices joined, some strong, some wavering, some choked with emotion. Even the guards stationed at the door didn't intervene. One of them, a young woman named Lou Martinez, hummed along softly. Then Ruth stepped forward from her post. Her eyes were wet. In careful accented German, she sang the second verse. Her voice cracked on the high notes, but she pushed through. Greta felt something break open in her chest. This was what they'd been told didn't exist. Mercy, order, fairness. This was what the propaganda had insisted was weakness, decadence, a lie told by soft nations doomed to fall. But here it was, real, tangible. A German Christmas song sung in harmony by women on opposite sides of a war that had consumed millions of lives. For the first time since capture, Greta allowed herself to feel something approaching gratitude. Maybe when she went home, if there was still a home to return to, she could help rebuild. Not the Germany that was, but something different, something better. Maybe she could spend the rest of her life trying to deserve this moment. The song ended. Silence settled, broken only by quiet weeping. Then Lisa Brandt stood up, her voice ringing out sharp and defiant, shattering the fragile peace. She began singing the anthem, the forbidden song. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with fanatic conviction. We are not defeated. We are prisoners of war, not charity cases, not dogs begging for scraps. Several women looked away, ashamed. But a few, 3 or 4 maybe, joined her quietly, their voices thin but present. Ruth moved fast. Shut it down. Now. Lisa turned to face her, chin raised in defiance. Then she spat at Ruth's feet. Traitor. German blood serving American masters. The words hung in the air like poison gas. 2 other guards moved in quickly. Colonel Hayes appeared in the doorway, her face grave. Take her to isolation. The celebration is over. Everyone back to your bunks. The tree was removed that night. The extra rations were confiscated. The paper snowflakes stayed up, but they looked different now, fragile and foolish, a dream that had died before it could fully form. Greta lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling. Around her, women wept, or cursed, or sat in stony silence. The barracks had fractured. There were those like Greta who had begun to accept the unacceptable truth, and there were those like Lisa who would die before admitting defeat. The distance between them was unbridgeable. Greta closed her eyes and tried to remember the feeling of singing in harmony, but all she could hear was Lisa's voice, shrill and unrepentant, echoing in the darkness. January brought news that arrived in terrible waves. The first wave came in the form of a mandatory assembly. Colonel Hayes stood before the gathered prisoners, her face carefully neutral. As part of your processing and repatriation preparation, you will be shown documentary evidence from the Nuremberg trials. This is not punishment. This is education. You have a right to know what was done in your country's name. The projector flickered to life in the camp's small recreation hall. Greta sat between Hilda and Inge, her hands clenched tight in her lap. The first images were familiar enough. Military tribunals, men in suits speaking into microphones. Then the footage changed. Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Dachau. Mountains of emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood. Living skeletons staring at cameras with hollow eyes. Children with numbers tattooed on their arms. Mass graves being bulldozed closed by men in gas masks. The projector's mechanical whir was the only sound in the room, beyond occasional gasps or stifled sobs. Greta stopped breathing. Her vision tunneled. She had known about camps. Everyone knew about camps. Dachau had been for political prisoners, communists, troublemakers. That was what they'd been told. Work camps, resettlement camps, harsh but necessary. But this was not harsh. This was extermination, industrial in scale, methodical, planned. Behind her, someone whispered, "We didn't know, we couldn't have known." But Greta remembered. The trains that passed her radar station at night, heading east. The cattle cars packed so tight that sometimes you could hear sounds from inside if the wind was right. The rumours everyone called British propaganda, too grotesque to be real. The way her neighbour Frau Goldstein had disappeared one morning and no one asked where she'd gone. We didn't want to know. The lights came back on. Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the room. You will have time to process what you've seen. Chaplains are available if you need to talk. You are dismissed." Greta walked back to the barracks in silence, her legs moving automatically. Inside, she sat on her cot and stared at the wall. Hilda tried to speak to her. Inga offered water. Greta didn't respond. The second wave arrived 3 days later at mail call. Greta's name was called. She approached the distribution table with trembling hands and accepted a thin envelope with her sister's handwriting on it. She waited until evening to open it, sat on her cot with the letter in her lap for 10 minutes before finding the courage to unfold the single page. The words blurred. She read them twice before they made sense. Cologne was 90% rubble. Their mother had died in a bombing raid in October of 1944, more than a year ago. Their father was missing, presumed dead in Soviet-controlled territory. Her sister Anna was living in a cellar with 2 other families, surviving on rations that barely kept them alive. Soviet soldiers were pushing west. Women were not safe. The final paragraph. "Don't come home, Greta. There's nothing left. You're better off there. At least the Americans feed you." Greta folded the letter carefully, set it on the mattress beside her. Then she lay down, turned to face the wall, and stopped existing in any meaningful way. She went through the motions for days, woke when told, ate when fed, worked in the library reshelving books with mechanical precision, spoke to no one. Even Lisa, released from isolation and sullen, avoided her. "She's already dead," Lisa muttered to another woman. "Just doesn't know it yet." Ruth found her on the 5th evening, sitting alone during recreation hour. Ruth pulled up a chair and sat without asking permission. "You got a letter." Greta said nothing. "Hoffman. Greta, talk to me." The words came out in German, barely audible. "Why? Why are you kind to us? We destroyed everything. My family is dead. My city is gone. I helped. I believed. Why don't you just hate us? It would be easier." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was rough. "You want to know why? My brother Tommy died on Omaha Beach, 22 years old. He wrote me before D-Day, said, 'Ruthie, we're not doing this for revenge. We're doing this so it stops, so their kids don't have to fight this same war again.'" Her voice cracked. She stopped, swallowed hard. "I do hate you sometimes. I hate what you stood for. I hate that Tommy's dead and you're alive. But if I torture you, if I starve you, if I become what you were, then Tommy died for nothing. Then we're just stuck in a cycle. Forever." She stood, wiped her eyes roughly. "So yeah, it's easier to hate, but easier doesn't rebuild the world." She walked away, leaving Greta alone in the gathering dusk. That night, Greta lay on her cot holding her sister's letter. The barracks was quiet, clean, safe. She was fed, warm, protected by the very people she had helped try to destroy, and she had never felt more lost. How did you live when everything you were had turned to ash? How did you wake up every morning knowing you'd believed in something so fundamentally evil you couldn't even comprehend the scope of it? How did you deserve to keep breathing when so many better people had stopped? February passed in a grey fog. Greta moved through the camp like a ghost, present but not alive. She worked in the library, ate her meals, returned to her bunk. The other women gave her space, unsure how to bridge the distance. Even Hilda, who'd attached herself to Greta like a lost puppy in the early weeks, kept her distance now. Ruth was assigned to psychiatric watch after 3 suicide attempts had occurred across different facilities. The camp command had implemented new protocols. Ruth began sitting with Greta during recreation hour, not speaking, just present. A silent vigil. Days passed, a week, then 2. Finally Greta spoke, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Do you think we can ever be forgiven?" Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know. Not by everyone. Maybe not by anyone." "Then what's the point?" Ruth leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "The point is that you're not dead. Your sister's not dead. And maybe you don't get forgiven. But maybe you get to do better. Isn't that something?" Greta had no answer, but the question lodged itself somewhere deep, a splinter she couldn't ignore. March brought the thaw, literal and metaphorical. Snow melted into mud. The days grew longer, and Greta slowly began to surface. She started writing letters to Anna, not about the past, but about the future. Small things at first. The food here is plain but sufficient. Oatmeal most mornings, sometimes powdered eggs. Then, as the weeks progressed, the letters grew bolder. When you come here, and I will sponsor you, I promise, you'll eat oranges. Real ones. I've seen them in the magazines. Bright as summer. She wrote about learning English, stumbling through verb conjugations with Lou Martinez, who teased her accent mercilessly but never cruelly. Maybe I can teach someday. Children need teachers, especially now. She wrote, "We'll rebuild. Not Germany as it was. Something different, something honest." Ruth shared pieces of her own family's story during their quiet hours in the library. Her grandparents had fled Prussian poverty in 1889 with nothing but a trunk and desperate hope. They'd built a bakery in a small Iowa town, raised 3 children. Tommy, the youngest, had been born American but died liberating the country his grandparents had fled. "We're all refugees from something," Ruth said one afternoon, reshelving books alongside Greta. "War, poverty, bad choices. Question is what you build next." The words settled over Greta like a benediction. In late March, Colonel Hayes announced a new initiative. Prisoners could volunteer to participate in war relief efforts, sewing clothes for displaced persons, packaging supplies for distribution. The colonel's voice was firm. "This is voluntary. No one will be punished for refusing." Some women did refuse. Lisa among them, her contempt radiating like heat. "I won't help mongrels and traitors." But Greta raised her hand. "Who receives the supplies?" Colonel Hayes met her gaze. "Everyone. Dutch, Polish, French, German. Kids don't pick their nationality." Greta nodded. "I'll help." The work was simple, meditative, cutting fabric, stitching seams, folding finished garments into boxes marked for shipment. The rhythm of the needle moving through cloth became a kind of prayer, stitch by stitch, something new from scraps. It wasn't redemption. She didn't deserve that. But it was useful. And usefulness, she discovered, was a form of dignity she'd thought lost forever. Hilda joined the effort, then Inga. Soon half the barracks was involved. The room filled with the quiet sounds of women working toward something larger than themselves. April brought repatriation notices, names called at morning assembly, women told to prepare for transport home. Lisa was among the first group. She gathered her few belongings with stiff-backed pride, refusing to look at Greta or any of the others who'd chosen to participate in the relief efforts. As she passed Greta's cot, she paused. "Enjoy your American paradise, traitor." Greta didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Lisa would return to Germany carrying her convictions like armour, uncracked, unbent. She would search for a Reich that no longer existed and probably die still searching. Greta felt a wave of pity so profound it hurt. Her own repatriation was scheduled for May. Ruth told her during their last shift together in the library. "Will you write to me?" Greta asked. "After." Ruth hesitated. Fraternization was forbidden. Then she pulled out a scrap of paper and wrote down an APO address. "Yeah, I will." "I don't know if I can ever make up for what I was part of," Greta started. "You can't," Ruth said bluntly. "None of us can erase it. But you can spend the rest of your life trying to be worth Tommy's sacrifice. All those boys' sacrifices. That's not forgiveness. That's work. But it's something." Greta folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket, a lifeline to carry into whatever came next. The morning of departure arrived with unexpected speed. Greta stood in line with 11 other women being processed for repatriation. They were given back their personal effects, such as they were. A wedding ring, a photograph, a rosary. Greta had nothing. Everything she'd owned had been lost or confiscated somewhere between the radar station and the cattle car that brought her across the Atlantic. Ruth appeared as the women were being loaded onto a bus that would take them to the train station. She handed Greta a small package wrapped in brown paper. For the journey, Greta unwrapped it carefully. Inside was the volume of Rilke from the library, along with a note in careful English. "You'll need this more than we do. Build something good. Ruth." Greta looked up, eyes stinging. "Thank you for everything." Ruth nodded once, sharp and military. "Don't waste it." The bus pulled away. Greta watched through the window as Fort Des Moines grew smaller, then disappeared entirely. Beside her, Hilda was crying quietly. Inga sat in stony silence. They were going home. But home was a word that meant something different now. Home was rubble and hunger and Soviet occupation. Home was guilt and grief and the enormous task of rebuilding not just buildings, but something more fundamental: the capacity to be human. The train ride took 3 days. They travelled through American cities that seemed impossibly intact. Buildings standing, streets functioning, people going about ordinary lives. The contrast to what waited in Germany was almost obscene. They boarded a ship in New York, a converted troop transport now carrying displaced persons back across the Atlantic. The voyage took 8 days. Greta spent most of it on deck, staring at the water, trying to prepare herself for what she'd find. When they finally docked in Bremerhaven, the scale of destruction became immediately apparent. The port was a skeleton. Cranes twisted into grotesque shapes, buildings gutted, mountains of rubble everywhere you looked. German civilians moved through the ruins like ghosts, hollow-eyed, searching for something that no longer existed. Greta and the other women were processed through a British-run displaced persons camp. More paperwork, more waiting, more questions about what they'd done during the war, where they'd served, what they'd believed. Greta answered honestly. Yes, she'd worked at a radar station. Yes, she'd believed in the cause. Yes, she'd worn the uniform. No, she hadn't been forced. She'd volunteered. The British officer taking her statement looked at her with something between pity and contempt. "You're one of the honest ones, at least. Most lie." Greta received travel papers and ration cards and directions to Cologne. The train journey took 2 days, travelling through a landscape of devastation. Every city they passed through was damaged. Some were merely scarred. Others were completely obliterated, just endless fields of rubble with a few walls standing here and there like broken teeth. Cologne was worse than she'd imagined. The cathedral still stood, damaged but recognisable, rising above an ocean of destruction. Everything else was gone. Her neighbourhood, her street, the building where she'd grown up, all of it reduced to piles of brick and twisted metal. She found Anna living in the cellar of what had once been an apartment building. Her sister was 10 years older than when Greta had last seen her, thin, grey, exhausted. They embraced without speaking, holding on to each other in the darkness. Anna's 2 children, nieces Greta had never met, watched from the corner with enormous eyes. Life in the ruins was harder than anything Greta had experienced, even in the cattle car, even in the days before Fort Des Moines. Food was scarce, water was contaminated, disease was everywhere. Soviet soldiers controlled the eastern zones and stories of what they did to women travelled through the ruins like poison. But Greta had something Anna didn't. She had Ruth's letters. They arrived every few weeks, miracles of military postal service. Ruth wrote about Iowa, about her bakery, about ordinary life continuing in a place that hadn't been bombed into dust. She wrote about Tommy and her grandmother and the strange mercy of getting to grieve in peace. She wrote, "You're doing the work. That's what matters. Keep going." Greta found work with the British occupation forces, translating documents, helping with civilian administration. The pay was meagre but regular. She brought home rations, soap, occasionally chocolate for the children. She also began teaching, setting up a small school in another cellar with 6 children and no books. She taught them English and mathematics and carefully edited versions of German literature. She taught them that the past was real and terrible and could not be denied, but that they were not sentenced to repeat it. Some of the other survivors hated her for it. Collaborator, British whore. They spat at her feet. But others, the ones who'd also begun to wake from the long nightmare, they brought their children to learn. Years passed. Slowly, impossibly slowly, something new began to emerge from the ruins. Not the Germany that was, but something different. The Federal Republic, democracy, trials and reckonings, and the long, painful process of looking at what had been done and trying to build something else. Greta married a widower, Heinrich, who'd lost his first wife in the bombing of Dresden. He'd been a conscripted soldier, wounded on the Eastern Front, and carried his own burden of guilt and questions. They understood each other. They built a small life in the ruins. They raised Anna's children alongside their own. They taught school. They participated in civic rebuilding. They tried, every single day, to be worth the mercy they'd been shown. Ruth's letters continued. Less frequently as the years went on, but they never stopped completely. In 1953, Ruth wrote that she was getting married to a veteran who'd lost an arm in the Pacific. In 1958, she wrote that they'd had a daughter, named her Ruth, after her grandmother. In 1961, the letters mentioned the bakery her parents had run was closing, victims of modernization and supermarkets. Through it all, she never forgot. Never stopped reminding Greta that the work wasn't finished, that rebuilding was a lifetime sentence, not a pardon. Greta never forgot either. She kept the volume of Rilke on her bedside table. Sometimes she read Herbstag aloud to Heinrich in the darkness. Lord, it is time. The summer was immense. She thought about Karl sometimes, frozen forever at 24, still believing in a cause that had led to ruin. She thought about Lisa, who she'd heard had died in the Soviet zone, still defiant, still certain. She thought about all the women in that barracks, scattered now across a broken continent, each carrying their own version of the weight. But mostly she thought about what Ruth had said. You don't get forgiven, you get to do better. So she did better. Day after day, year after year, teaching children, helping rebuild, participating in democracy, speaking honestly about the past even when it was uncomfortable, refusing to let the new generation pretend it hadn't happened, refusing to let them forget. And on the hard days, when the guilt threatened to crush her, when she wondered if she had any right to happiness or peace or ordinary life, she pulled out Ruth's letters and read them again. You're doing the work. Keep going. The work never ended. Even decades later, when she was an old woman with grandchildren who'd never known war, who'd grown up in a federal republic that bore almost no resemblance to the country she'd been born into, the work continued. Remembering, bearing witness, teaching, trying to be worthy. It wasn't redemption. She'd long since stopped believing in that, but it was something. A life built from ruins. A choice made every morning to get up and try again. To be better than what she'd been, to honour the mercy she'd been shown by showing it forward. And sometimes, on autumn days when the light slanted through the trees in that particular way, she would recite the poem quietly to herself. Whoever has no house now will never have one. But she had built a house from rubble, not the one she'd imagined in her youth, but something real, something honest, something worth the struggle. That, she thought, was the best any of them could hope for. To take the broken pieces and build something new. To spend a lifetime trying to be worth the grace you'd been given. To remember what was lost without being destroyed by the memory. To choose, every single day, to do better. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't absolution. But it was life. And life, even scarred and complicated and heavy with history, was still worth living. Still worth fighting for. Still worth the work.